The famous Swiss philosopher Ferdinand de Saussure once said, "Without language, thought is a vague, uncharted nebula." If we begin to fundamentally examine the sounds we use to communicate our thoughts, you might first ask yourself, how is it that we've evolved these sounds to have meaning? Of course, today, we all start learning language and the meaning behind each word from a very young age, starting with numbers, letters, and eventually moving to animals and other objects within our world. But before our species arrived at this moment, how is it that we've come to understand one another and share the thoughts within our minds to others for them to understand in a similar way? We can begin to imagine our early ancestors, with some newfound knowledge of to say, avoid getting mauled by a bear, would be eager to share this knowledge with others. And yet, without the power of language, how might one communicate this knowledge to others within their circle? Before we get into deconstructing language, we must first understand the basic structures of how language works. Saussure, in his book Course in General Linguistics, published posthumously from notes taken from his students, would revolutionize our fundamental understanding of the basic structure of language through his definition of signs. Signs, more specifically words, give us the ability to assign things we can conceptualize around us. When I say cat, for instance, you can see an image of a cat in your head. The phrase cat, Saussure has defined as the signifier, and the image or concept in your head as the signified. I can do this again if I say tree, baseball, or sadness. This seemingly magical ability for me to put an image in your head is what Saussure would go on to call structuralism. Through analyzing structuralism, we can start to see that language is entirely built on this concept that all things said produce an image or idea in our minds. We all tend to have a general similarity in the images that come into our minds when someone says a phrase to produce an image. To dig even further into how this process works, Saussure defines our ability to envision the signified by envisioning what it is not. While some of us may not fully understand what sadness is, we all can agree what it is not. The same can be said for nearly every concept we have given meaning when imagining the signified. Robert Dale Parker, in his book How to Interpret Literature, says if we boil down structuralism down to one idea, it is about understanding concepts through the relation to other concepts, rather than understanding them intrinsically, in isolation from each other. We cannot begin to describe cold without using some idea of hot in our description. Darkness is the absence of light. North is the opposite of south, and so on. While these binaries may seem like complete opposites to one another, deconstructionists have entered the chat and would like to have a word. Deconstruction, born out of the mind of the famous French philosopher Jacques Derrida, doesn't mean to destroy these binaries. In fact, they mean to expand upon them. It offers more, not less. In deconstruction, there is always more, a surplus of meaning and rhetoric that is called supplement. You see, when I say the signifier dog, we all draw upon a signified image of a dog in our head. But who is to say that we all think of the very same dog? Dogs can vary in color and size, and while I may try to signify a more definitive dog by saying big yellow dog, the image in everyone's head can still vary. Deconstruction aims to point out that no matter how definitive we may signify a phrase, language will never accomplish my thought to your head in the same way that I see it. The more I try to convey the signifier, the more complicated the signified image in your head can become. A multiplicity of definitions arises, and the use of language, while effective, can never completely achieve what the structuralist claims it does. Structuralists, while examining a text, argue that language can provide a center of understanding, a pivotal scene, word, or character, and describe it as essential to the overall work. They argue that the central feature shapes the rest of the play or novel in a meaningful light that lends to a particular interpretation. Parker goes on to say, deconstructionists often turn their attention to what they call decentering. Deconstructionists do not believe that systems can be secure or unified, or that we can capture cultural objects with a single explanation. Instead, everything is multiple, unstable, and without unity. In this view, we cannot tie language down. We cannot tie the signified to the signifier. In order to deconstruct a signifier, we need to understand the center of the definition, or learn the concept as it has been legitimized, identical to itself, as the aristocratic thinker would claim as object purity. But as we evolve to use language more and more, we can see that the binaries we associate the world with aren't as concrete, and words can have multiple meanings, or multiple words for the same meaning, further eroding the division of the structuralist binary. Here's an example. Here we see a sign on a door that says "Seeing Eye Dogs Only." The structuralists will claim that the only kind of dog that is allowed beyond the door is a dog that assists the blind. But is it though? Could one not also interpret the sign to mean that humans aren't allowed through? Are blind dogs not also allowed through? Upon second reading of the sign, we can see that language will always have multiple meanings. The signified and the signifier will never seem as binary as we might have first thought. Derrida claims that words and the meanings behind them are expansive. Words cannot give the true meaning of what is conveyed, and as language evolves, these meanings can change or altogether be lost. But no matter how hard we try, everyone understands language differently, with their own experiences altering their interpretation. True meaning within words will never exist. While Saussure claims that we can aim to make sense of this ambiguity through the use of binaries, Derrida challenges the idea of a binary as a construct that we have invented, one that may not even exist in nature. In other words, binaries are self-imposed and may very well not exist at all. It is easy to categorize things into two meanings, what it is and what it is not. But in doing so, what we are missing are the complexities between the relations of the concepts and their opposites. Meaning, when we simplify things through a binary, the complexities are lost. Using language to define a binary leaves out the vast interpretation that never really ceased to exist. We could do this to the work of literature as well. Let us apply this double reading process to Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. Nathaniel Hawthorne's Puritan romance, published in 1850, is a story about Hester Prynne, a woman who had a daughter out of wedlock. In the beginning of the novel, she is publicly humiliated and labeled an adulterer with the symbol of a letter A permanently sewn onto her clothes. In the initial reading of this book, the structural binary Hawthorne seems to be suggesting is fairly obvious. The harsh Puritan society has labeled Hester a sinner, unable to redeem herself from the judgment that her sin has given her. The Puritans in this book are described as wielding their religion as a form of establishing law, enforcing binaries between what is holy, law, and unholy, lawlessness. Yet the story Hawthorne goes on to tell doesn't stick to these signifiers. Hester is described as holding signifiers that would be given to a saint, not a sinner. The supposed unredeeming sinner finds herself revealing the irony of sin that is found within the townspeople, and carrying herself not in a way of shame, but in a way of purity. Instead, Hawthorne has given her qualities unseeming for a sinner to have, and described the pestilence within the townspeople, uncharacteristic of the holy people we might have first thought. Dimmesdale, the supposed holy minister, representing purity and a faith-loving man, is instead in anguish from his secret affair. Hawthorne describes this man of holy faith to be one who has lied, unwilling to confess his sins to the people his faith is supposed to represent. The description of the forest in the book is in opposition to the town square, where society is civilized and the forest is savage. Yet it is here in the woods that we notice some form of peace and purity, and away from the civilized town that doesn't describe a place of civility, but instead a place of judgment, scorn, or better put, evil. The letter A itself, not ever defined in the book, and only assumed to mean adultery, also transitions from a negative symbol signifying Hester's sin to a positive symbol signifying her rebirth. Nasrallah Menbral, a scholar of philosophy, literature, and cultural studies, points out that Hawthorne's purpose of breaking down these common binaries as a way of presenting the truth of the human heart. He goes on to say, central to Nathaniel Hawthorne's romances and his idea of a neutral territory, or somewhat between the real world and fairyland, where the actual and the imaginary may meet, and each imbue itself with the nature of the other. It is for this reason that these characters don't seem to stand out, despite not holding to the typical signifiers they are supposed to represent. By breaking down the strict binaries these characters should represent, we are left with an ending that is redeeming to those characters, who may otherwise never deserve forgiveness in the first place. Deconstruction allows us to expand the meaning of language and uncover the complexities of the world. While language is effective in giving meaning to the concept of life and the ins and outs of our experiences, it is through the breaking down of binaries that we can further decipher the ambiguity that language can sometimes conceal. Understanding that language can never perfectly give one true meaning, we can continue to learn that our experiences may differ from others, infinitely expanding our knowledge of what it means to be human.